In 1790, after a long and arduous voyage from England, John and Elizabeth Macarthur arrived at Sydney Cove with their infant son Edward. John was an ambitious young officer in the New South Wales Corps, determined to make a success of life in the new colony. Elizabeth was an even-tempered and practical young woman, as equal to the demands of colonial life as she was to her husband's difficult character. In 1793, the Macarthurs were granted 40 hectares of prime land at Parramatta, and with ample access to convict craftsmen, built a house that was to become the prototype for the Australian homestead. John named the property Elizabeth Farm, and by the turn of the century, the Macarthurs had 6 children and owned 652 hectares. The family's fortunes increased despite the disagreements Macarthur had with both Governors Phillip and Hunter. When Hunter sought to limit the commercial dealings of the officers of the Corps, Macarthur successfully campaigned to have him replaced as governor. However, in 1801, Macarthur was arrested for wounding his commanding officer in a duel and sent back to London for court-martial. When the English authorities found it impossible to court-martial him, he turned his attention to a rousing interest in New South Wales wool. Lord Camden granted him 2,000 hectares of land, and he returned to New South Wales in 1805 with 5 rams and a ewe from the King's Spanish merino flock. For the site of his new agricultural venture, he chose land known as the cow pastures. It was an inspired choice. 7 years earlier, 4 cows and 2 bulls had wandered into the bush from Sydney. When they were eventually found grazing beside the Nepean River, they had grown to a herd of more than 40, having thrived on the plentiful supply of food and water in a region with a long history of Aboriginal occupation.
In the early 1800s, there was a lot of conflict between the colonists and the Aboriginal people. After the massacre that took place in 1816 at Appin, those that remained of my family members actually moved on to the Macarthur property, where they were freely welcomed by Elizabeth Macarthur herself mostly. I'm a descendant of one of the children, one of the daughters of Nanny, or Girabunga her name was.
With his pastoral and commercial interests continuing to prosper, John Macarthur was drawn into another serious conflict with the governor of the day. William Bligh, the infamous captain of the Bounty, was determined to break down the commercial monopoly he felt Macarthur and the officers of the Corps had enjoyed for too long. After a prolonged period of political instability, Macarthur persuaded the Corps commander, Major George Johnson, to remove Bligh from office. In January 1808, Johnson marched on Government House and placed Bligh under house arrest. John Macarthur had virtual control of the colony for 6 months before he sailed to England to support Major Johnson at his court-martial. During her husband's 9-year absence, Elizabeth managed their farms at both Parramatta and Camden with the assistance of John's nephew, Hannibal Macarthur. When Governor Macquarie visited her at Camden in 1810, he found her sitting cheerfully and businesslike in what he described as a small and miserable hut. While in England, John Macarthur unsuccessfully attempted to expand his mercantile interests, and by 1812 he was considered in debt. His letters to his wife alternated between optimism and depression, and through them she witnessed the progress of his political lobbying for his return home. Eventually, John Macarthur was allowed back to New South Wales on the condition he would have nothing to do with the affairs of the colony. He returned to Sydney with his sons, James and William, in 1817, bringing with them a significant collection of grapevine cuttings from Europe, which they used to establish the original vineyard. That year, the Macarthur estate produced 300 kilograms of high-quality wool for export, and introduced an innovative method of washing the sheep before they were shorn. This innovation continued with the Macarthurs developing Camden Park into an experimental farm years ahead of its time. They introduced advanced methods of sheep breeding, wool sorting and bale pressing, and retained a good tree cover on the ridge tops and along river and creek banks, an unusual practice at the time, but one that is now recognised as a valuable approach to the reduction of soil erosion and damage to the environment. The Camden Park orchard had a large variety of fruits, including olives, that were brought back from Europe by Macarthur and his sons, and in keeping with the family's resourceful policies, the fruit blown from the trees by the wind was fed to their 200 pigs. The pigsties, which now stand at the northern end of the stables, are a part of Australia's most important collection of rural buildings and formed the nucleus of the original Camden Park estate. The cottage was built in several stages from 1820 and was an important residence for the Mcarthur family during the formative years of the farm. One of the family's 4 creameries was adapted in 1898 from the original 1820s coach house. Cream was taken by horse and cart to the Macarthur's butter factory at nearby Menangle. The stables, built in 1826, are considered to be the most important buildings in the farm group, as well as being the biggest. Whole tree trunks of local ironbark hold up the roof. The building, now referred to as the granary, started life as an implement shed and is a fine example of post and beam construction of 1888. Contemporary alterations allow it to be used as a restaurant and function room, while still retaining the heritage values of the building. The Macarthurs offered their best workers secure tenancy and encouraged them to take up freehold plots of land on the estate. By 1850, nearly 900 people lived on Camden Park.
I can remember dances, Christmas parties, all those kind of things. For my own father, who actually lived in the house down the road here, my great-great-grandmother actually died in the house where the information centre is now.
In 1829, with his sons James and William managing the farm, John Macarthur was appointed to the Legislative Council. However, he was now suffering from long bouts of depression. His condition worsened after he received news of his son John's death in London, and he was confined to his old bedroom at the cottage. It was here, in his more lucid moments, that he witnessed the building of the family mansion at Camden Park. Members of the family still live in the house today. John Mcarthur died in 1834. His wife Elizabeth lived quietly at Elizabeth Farm at Parramatta, where she maintained a passive interest in colonial politics and her family's estates until her death in 1850 at the age of 83. After the death of John and Elizabeth, the Macarthur family carried on their pioneering farming methods in horticulture, cropping, wine production and dairying. In 1952, the ultimate in milking machinery was introduced to the estate. The rotalactor was designed to milk 2,500 cows twice a day, which was a significant increase on traditional shed capacity. The property is still at the forefront of agricultural technology, with the Elizabeth Macarthur Agricultural Institute operating as a centre of excellence for animal and plant health. The Institute is a cutting-edge research and diagnostic facility whose scientists are world leaders in their fields. Their work provides a first line of defence against any emerging or exotic diseases, as well as ensuring Australia's competitiveness in international markets.
We consider that the sites on the Elizabeth Macarthur Agricultural Institute are well protected. A lot of sites in our area here have been destroyed or damaged by developments like housing, etc. On the property here, they are actually protected from that sort of development.
A large part of the original Camden Park estate was acquired by the New South Wales Government in 1976. Managed by the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries through the Belgenny Farm Trust and the invaluable assistance of the Friends of Belgenny Farm, it offers visitors a unique insight into life on the land that is recognised as the birthplace of Australian agriculture.